Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? But you would give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
Oh shit! I didn't even have my mic on, did I? Okay, sorry about that. Um, we are halfway through the last chapter of the final, or halfway through the last chapter, glimpses in this book, and then I only got one vote on the poll for the next book, so that's what we're going with. And I'll get to that at the end. But anyway, here we go. It can, I think, be seen that James's experience of expanding horizons of fact is nothing less than a sudden total awakening of Faculty X, which is, as I have said, a sense of the objective reality of other times and places, instead of the usual subjective worm's eye view in which we are trapped all our lives. It is like standing on a mountain top and seeing far more than you are able to see from the valley. In fact, Priestley's image of the mist rising on the Grand Canyon expresses it admirably. It can be understood by why Graves felt he knew everything while this glimpse lasted. Equally interesting is the fact that although James believes that such experiences are bound to be momentary, Graves's lasted for about 24 hours. This is of immense importance, for the experience that suddenly happened to Graves was a kind of mental counterpart of Hume's ability to float in the air. And it lasted. If it could last for a day, there is no reason why it should not last all the time. It is necessary to try to gain further insight into the nature of this glimpse. It is quite clearly that what the mystics have always talked about, and the mystics have asserted that it is ineffable, that it cannot be talked about or analyzed. In this book we have gone a long way toward analyzing it, and perhaps may go further still. Warner Allen, in his interesting book The Timeless Moment, describes how he experienced the fundamental mystical glimpse. And this is a very long quote, almost a full page. Quote, "When the writer was on the threshold of 50, it occurred to him that it must have occurred to many another ordinary journalist, no less hostile to the apparent sloppiness of fashionable mysticism than he was, that he had lived for nearly half a century without discerning in life any pattern of rational purpose. His views on the matter might have been roughly summed up in a vague notion that the universe was shrouded in impenetrable darkness by the powers of life and death. For fear life should lose its savor as a brave adventure. If the mystery of death and suffering was solved, and uncertainty was exchanged for the assurance of future beatitude, a curiously vivid dream shook his faith in this tentative explanation of human ignorance. This quest of truth led through paths of unforeseen darkness and danger, but within a year an answer came. It flashed up lightning-wise during a performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony at the Queen's Hall, in that triumphant fast moment when the morning stars sang together and all the songs of God shouted for joy, quote unquote, inside this quote. The swiftly flowing continuity of the music was not interrupted, so that when Mr. T.S. Eliot calls the intersection of the timeless moment with time must have slipped into the interval between two semi-quavers. When long after I analyzed the happening in the cold light of retrospect, it seemed to fall into three parts. First, the mysterious event itself, which occurred in an infinitesimal fraction of a split second. This I learned afterwards from Santa Teresa to call the union with God. Then illumination, a wordless stream of complex feelings in which the experience of union combined with the rhythmic emotion of the music, like a sunbeam striking with iridescence the spray above a waterfall, a stream that was continually swollen by tributaries of associated experience. Lastly, enlightenment, the recollection in tranquility of the whole complex of experience, as it were, embalmed in thought forms and words. End quote. That this is the experience William James is talking about becomes almost certain when we consider James's preliminary remark that his own experiences were extremely brief. Quote, in one instance, I was engaged in conversation, but I doubt whether the interlocutor noticed my abstraction. End quote. Allen's second phase, the wordless stream of complex feelings that was swollen by tributaries of associated experience, quote unquote, makes it clear that this is what outward expansion of associations described by James. In short, the pleasure and excitement of the music energized Warner Allen's mind until suddenly, like a spark flying upward, it achieved insight, the bird's eye view. This is the mystical experience that Chesterton described as a feeling of quote-unquote absurd good news. The joy that burst on Faust as he heard the Easter bells, the overwhelming feeling of insight that often accompanies the sexual orgasm. Charlotte Bronte describes a similar glimpse in Shirley, a sudden ecstatic vision of life as she wishes it. No, this is a quote, sorry. Quote, vision of life as she wishes it. No, not as she wishes it. She has not time to wish. The swift glory spreads out, sweeping and kindling its splendor faster than thought can effect its combinations, faster than aspiration can utter her longings. End quote. Here the language is so similar to James's that one could almost believe he was unconsciously quoting it. Excuse me, sorry. In A Drug Taker's Notes, R.H. Ward describes his own experiences with lysergic acid, but then concludes that they were not genuine mystical experiences. By way of contrast, he quotes a mystical experience of a friend of his. Quote, last night, as I was walking home from the station, I had one of those strange experiences of rising up within oneself, of coming inwardly alive. A minute or so after I had left the station, I was attacked by indigestion. I thought to myself, though I suppose not in so many words, I could separate myself from this pain. It belongs only to my body, and is really only to the physical, not self. There is no need for the self to feel it. Even as I thought this, the pain disappeared. That is, it was in some way left behind because I, or the self, had gone somewhere where it was not, and the sensation of rising up within began. I have the impression that movement encouraged this sensation. It kind of trails off there. First, there is the indescribable sensation in the spine as of something mounting up, a sensation that is partly pleasure and partly awe, a physical sensation, and yet one which, if it makes sense to say so, is beginning to be not physical. This was accompanied by the extraordinary feeling of bodily lightness, of well-being and effortlessness, as if one's limbs had no weight and one's flesh had been suddenly transmuted into some rarer substance. But it was also, somehow, a feeling of living more in the upper part of one's body than the lower, a certain peculiar awareness of one's head as the most important and intelligent of one's members. There was also a realization that one's facial expression was changing. The eyes were wider open than usual. The lips were involuntarily smiling. Everything was becoming more. Everything was going up on to another level. I found that I could think in a new way, or rather, it would be more accurate to say that I could think and feel in a new way, for it was hard to distinguish between thought and feeling. This was like becoming possessed of a new faculty. End quote. Excuse me. He describes a feeling of delight associated with ordinary objects, and this has much in common with Aldous Huxley's description of his sensation of the isness of being under mescaline. However, the experience certainly seems to have involved an awareness of those other dimensions of time. For example, he explains that he thought that death not only ceased to be something to fear, but that death seemed positively to become dear beauteous death, quote unquote. He adds that he felt as though he could easily give up his own life because, quote, it was self-evident that we live in other ways than corporeal, end quote. Significantly, it was important to avoid negative emotions, distrust, fear, contempt, because they immediately began to, quote unquote, bring him down. And even more significant, he felt that if his present state of mind could somehow be conveyed to a friend dying of cancer, she would be cured because, quote, like any other ugliness or evil, cancer could not exist as such in the presence of God, end quote. At the same time, he felt that it did not matter that this physical organism of hers died. This experience calls for many comments. Although he says that he separated himself from the pain of indigestion, it is clear that the indigestion vanished. It was a negative thing, and the upward leap of the mind dismissed it. The method of achieving a higher state of mind, deliberately reminding yourself that you are quite different from your body, is familiar to mystics. For example, the modern Hindu saint Sri Ramana Maharshi, Sir Ramana Maharshi, experienced his first ecstasy as a result of thinking about the death of his body, then suddenly grasping as a fact that he was a deathless self, quite distinct from the body. Certainly the sensation of something mounting up in the spine corresponds to the Hindu description of the rise of Kundalini. The reference to the flesh feeling as if it had been transmuted into a rarer substance seems to confirm that Jung says of alchemy as a symbol of higher states of mind. The feeling that cancer could be cured by this state of mind certainly echoes the belief of Christian Science, which, as we have seen, receives abundant confirmation in occult tradition. Another example will reinforce the point I am making here. In Arrow in the Blue, Arthur Koestler describes two experiences in which he achieved this sudden transcendence. In the first, he was reading a pamphlet about atrocities in Palestine and feeling himself choke and seethe with impotent anger. Wow. Palestine, huh? Anyway, he admits that he suffers from chronic indigestion, as others do from chronic indigestion. He suffers. Sorry, I misread that. He admits he suffers from chronic indignation, as others do from chronic indigestion. While still in this state, he picked up a book by Hermann Weyl on Einstein and read the comment that relativity had led the human imagination across the peaks and glaciers never before explored by any human being. And that's a quote from across to being. And then, quote, I saw Einstein's world-shaking formula. Energy equals mass multiplied by the square of the velocity of light. Hovering in a kind of rarefied haze over the glaciers, and this image carried a sensation of infinite tranquility and peace. The martyred infants and castrated pioneers of the Holy Land shrank to microscopic insignificance. Oh, okay, we're still in the middle of the quote, sorry. The fate of these unfortunates had to be viewed with the same serene, detached, meditative eye as that of stars bursting into novae, of sunspots erupting, of rocks decaying into swamps, and primeval forests being transformed into coal. This change in perspective was accompanied by an equally pronounced physiological change. The sensation of choking with indignation was succeeded by the relaxed quietude and self-dissolving stillness of the oceanic feeling. End quote. This is a phase used by Freud in his Civilization and its Discontents. And Freud tries to explain it away in terms of father fixations, etc. The second experience makes the point even more clearly. Koestler was in a Spanish jail during the Civil War. sentenced to death, and he began scratching mathematical formulae on the wall to pass the time. He went on to work out Euclid's classic proof that there is no largest prime number, and he did so. He experienced a deep satisfaction due to the sudden thought that Euclid was establishing a truth about infinity using finite means. Quote, "The significance of this swept over me like a wave. The wave had originated in an articulate verbal insight, but this evaporated at once, leaving in its wake only a wordless essence, a fragrance of eternity, a quiver of the arrow in the blue. I must have stood there for some minutes, entranced with a wordless awareness that this is perfect, perfect, until I noticed some slight mental discomfort nagging at the back of my mind, some trivial circumstance that marred the perfection of the moment. Then I remembered the nature of that irrelevant annoyance. I was, of course, in prison and might be shot, but this was immediately answered by a feeling whose verbal translation would be, 'So what? Is that all? Have you nothing more serious to worry about?' An answer so spontaneous, fresh, and amused, as if the intruding annoyance had been the loss of a collar stud. Then I was floating on my back in a river of peace, under bridges of silence." End quote. This makes it quite clear that the experience we are now discussing is Priestley's second level of time, time 2, which he experienced looking at the fish. But is it necessary to postulate these different times? Surely all we need postulate is different levels of the personality. Let us say, for the sake of convenience, that human beings have two poles, a personal and an impersonal pole. The personal pole is evident if I am suddenly in danger. Let us say that I nearly have a street accident, and I instantly feel contingent. For a brief moment, the only thing I care about is self-preservation. Most people are excessively personal. They brood too much on their ills and their worries and resentments. When this happens, the vision becomes narrow. I have elsewhere suggested a convenient term for this narrowness, monoconsciousness. If I am sitting in a stuffy room, bored and dull, I am stuck in one single reality, the reality that surrounds me. If rain patters on the window, the sudden delight I experience is due to being suddenly reminded of the existence of another reality out there. This is duo consciousness, and it is what happens to Faust when he hears the Easter bells. The delighted feeling, yes, something else exists. We are normally trapped in this stuffy room of subjectivity, but when duo consciousness comes, it is as if I can breathe deeply. I then realize the immensely important fact that my soul can suffocate just as easily as my body. It can die for lack of a kind of oxygen. It is exactly like the relief of the sexual orgasm. As described by D.H. Lawrence, for example, it is accompanied by an odd sensation of invulnerability, an insight to the effect, "I need never suffocate again, now I know this," quote unquote. And as if I had obtained a magic talisman capable of forever protecting me from suffocation, it is a sudden knowledge of my own strength. The various experiences described above sound as if they are visitations, sudden descents of the dove, that human beings can do nothing to control. Shelley addresses the spirit of beauty and asks, quote, "Why dost thou pass away and leave our state? This dim, vast vale of tears, vacant and desolate." End quote. Sorry. And that is indeed the most fundamental problem of human existence. Why does it? Why do our certainties, our ecstasies, and intensities evaporate so easily, leaving us with a feeling like a hangover? Husserlian psychology teaches that the correct approach is to examine the problem with the practical eye of a garage mechanic wondering why a car is not pulling. At this point, I must make an attempt to present my own analysis of the totality of man and try to pull the themes of this book into some sort of unity. My most basic insight is this, that there is something wrong with human beings. When you have a bad cold, you have a continual sense of oppression. You don't seem to be able to draw a really deep breath. You feel as if you are suffocating, and you are certainly aware that this state is not normal. But all human beings are suffering permanently from a kind of spiritual head cold, and they are not aware of it. Sometimes, when they are unusually worried or tired, the sense of suffocation becomes so oppressive that it turns into panic, and this can be the beginning of severe mental illness. And then there are the occasional moments when the head clears, a kind of bubble seems to burst at the back of the nose, and you can suddenly breathe and see and hear with a new freshness. Something inside us wakes up and is delighted by the world it finds itself in. The universe is seen to be infinitely interesting and complex. In all these moments of intensity, newness, we are aware of the sense of inner contraction, as if one's consciousness were a fist that had become clenched. Excuse me. And this is the vital clue. We know that our bodies are made up of a swarm of electrons, buzzing around like bees, held together by inner forces of attraction. But the same is true of the astral body, or whatever you choose to call the living, thinking, feeling me. It is also a swarm of particles like bees, but it differs from the physical body in one important respect. Your physical body always has the same size and shape, more or less, but this mental body can expand into a vague, diffuse cloud or contract until it seems to be a glowing ball of intensity. It was A.E. Hausman who pointed out that the test of true poetry is that it makes the hair prickle. It also causes this mental body to contract. The skin seems to become tighter. Sartre describes it in his novel Nausea. Quote, I felt my body harden and the nausea vanish. Suddenly, it was almost unbearable to become so hard, so brilliant. End quote. He also says, quote, I feel my body at rest like a precision machine. End quote. These images capture the feeling of contraction, hardness, almost as if the skin had changed into a chrome-plated steel. The same thing happens in the sexual orgasm, a feeling of inner contraction. It is the first step toward what Shaw calls, quote, the seventh degree of concentration, end quote. This is what Proust experienced when he tasted the Madeleine dipped in tea and suddenly ceased to feel mediocre, accidental, or mortal, end quote. Okay. The feeling was not an illusion. He had accidentally stumbled upon a perfectly normal power of the human soul, Faculty X. We are not mediocre, accidental, mortal, even though most of the time we feel we are. I have pointed out that there is an impressive mass of evidence for the existence of the astral body, but for present purposes it makes no difference whether it really exists or whether it is regarded as a figure of speech. To verify the reality of the inner contraction, you only have to take the trouble to observe yourself next time you experience sudden intense delight. Once this is recognized, the analysis may be carried further. It will be seen that a certain degree of contraction produces the sense of poetry, Shelley's spirit of beauty, the peak experience. A further contraction produces a sense of being able to act, that Priestley calls the third dimension of time. This is the state of insight when all the faculties seem to be speeded up. It explains why men become racing drivers and mountain climbers or go into the desert like T.E. Lawrence, because they want to face an emergency that forces them to contract to this new level of control. At a certain point of concentration, a chain reaction begins to develop. Readers who have studied atomic physics will know that this is the principle of the atom bomb. Uranium-235 is an isotope that disintegrates continually because of its radioactivity. In small masses, the disintegration proceeds slowly, but if more than a certain critical mass is brought together, the disintegration suddenly accelerates wildly, because the bullets of energy thrown out by the atoms score direct hits on the nuclei of other atoms, causing them to disintegrate, and the exploding atoms shoot out still more like bullets, which strike still more nuclei. The result is an atomic explosion. In an atomic explosion, In an atomic bomb, two small masses of uranium-235 are suddenly hurled together, creating a critical mass which explodes. There's an analogous principle in concentration. At a certain point, one's mental being, the swarm of bees, seems to reach a certain critical mass, and a chain reaction develops. Something of the sort seems to have happened to Robert Graves as he sat on the garden roller. At this point, an interesting phenomenon occurs. States of sudden intense happiness often seem to disintegrate as if from their own inner pressure. In the same way, if two small masses of uranium-235 are brought together to form a critical mass, the result will not be a massive explosion, because the reaction that ensues will blow them apart again, scattering the uranium before it can explode. In an atomic bomb, they have to be held together. This explains why mystical intensities, such as was experienced by Warner Allen in Queen's Hall, quote, between two notes of a symphony, end quote, is usually so brief. It causes its own disintegration. But why, if the mystic wants to keep... What? But why, if the mystic wants to keep it so badly? The answer is of fundamental importance, because the muscles that could hold it are flabby and undeveloped. We only make use of these muscles involuntarily, when suddenly stirred by beauty or by a sense of crisis, and this in itself is preposterous. Wow, I'm having trouble here. Sorry. As if you only use the muscles in your leg when someone tapped you on the knee, causing a reflex action. Okay, I'm going to pause real quick, and I will be back in just a minute. Okay, where were we? Okay. We possess the muscles for compressing consciousness, and producing states of intensity, but we use them so seldom that we are hardly aware of their existence. My simile of the atom bomb can be carried further. An atom bomb can be used as the detonator of a hydrogen bomb. The fusion of hydrogen, which is what produces the sun's heat, requires temperatures and pressures as intense as those in the heart of the sun. These can be produced momentarily if an atom bomb, which works as fission, disintegration, is exploded inside a mass of compressed hydrogen, which then fuses into the more complex helium atom, producing an explosion 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Human consciousness is theoretically capable of this kind of power. Man is literally a god suffering from laziness, amnesia, and nightmares. The Catholics call this fault of human consciousness original sin. Heidegger calls it forgetfulness of existence. But it is important to understand that it is not a basic flaw. As odd as that it may sound, we suffer from the spiritual head cold because we want to. A man who wants to think locks himself into a quiet room and perhaps closes all the windows. This has its advantages and disadvantages. It allows him to concentrate, but it cuts out the fresh air and the sound of the birds. When I have to concentrate, for example, when I'm writing these pages, I lock myself into an inner room and close all the windows. If I now decide to go for a walk, I cannot simply open all these windows again. It takes time to unwind, to relax. This is why most human beings spend their lives in a highly uncomfortable state of generalized hypertension without knowing what to do about it. When we are worried, there seem to be two possible courses. One is to do something about it, to look for a way out. The other is to go on feeling worried, to accept it passively as we accept a bad cold or a toothache. There is a third course, but most of us are unaware of it. When the man wants something badly or wants to avoid something badly, he makes an immense effort of concentration, an inner convulsion. The mental body contracts, and the result is a new sense of power, control, and freedom. Graham Greene's whiskey priest, on the point of being shot by a firing squad, realized that, quote, it would have been so easy to be a saint, end quote. Why? Because the threat of immediate extinction causes the inner convulsion, a greater effort of will than he has made in years, perhaps in the whole of his life, and he realizes with a shock that if he had made the same effort of will earlier, he need not have wasted his life. Yeah. Man possesses the power to contract his astral body by an act of will. He is not aware that he possesses this power. The proof of his ignorance is his capacity for boredom. Boredom is the expansion of the astral body, in which the swarm of bees becomes a vague, diffuse cloud. In this state, we experience a kind of nausea, and the sense of meaning vanishes. Life fails. The inner energies drop. The next stage in human evolution will be the deliberate development of this muscle of the will and a corresponding development of the sense of meaning. It can be seen that, according to this scheme of evolution, Priestley's three orders of time become unnecessary. Time 1 is the way I experience time when I am passive and unfocused. Time 2 is the way I experience it when my mind becomes self-governing, which is what happens when I focus on meaning. Time 3 is the way I experience time when the creative chain reaction begins, when I experience a sense of total control of my mental processes, an unwavering perception of meaning. These are some interesting points to observe about these three time experiences. The most tiring of the three is time 1, a passive living in the present. If I feel exhausted, the best way to recover is to find something that deeply interests me and concentrate on it. If I am exhausted and bored, the curious result is that I continue to run down still further, like a car whose ignition has been left switched on. This principle has been used in the brainwashing of spies. The spy is placed in a completely black and silent room, and as soon as he becomes acutely bored, his will relaxes, his sense of meaning ebbs away, a feeling of misery and panic begins to build up, and his vital forces disintegrate. He begins to feel increasingly mediocre, accidental, and mortal in this state. He is easy prey for an interrogator. Okay. On the other hand, if I am bored and tired, and then something happens that arouses my deepest interest, I ignore the fatigue, I can concentrate, and my vital batteries begin to recharge at a fast rate. On the other hand, no. Sorry, I skipped back up at a recharge at a fast rate. The time 3 experience is the most interesting because it involves the most total control. If I am deeply involved in the contemplation of something else, like Toynbee at Mistra or Priestley outside the fish shop, I am still basically passive, my mind turned outward. This is time 2. But in times of intense mental activity and concentration, I am aware of being in charge of a chain reaction. That is, the more deeply I concentrate, the more I focus meaning, and the more I focus meaning, the more intensely I concentrate. Okay, sorry, struggling here tonight for some reason. I have myself experienced a sense of power over time on 2 occasions. On the first of these, I was working in a hospital in a job that bored me. Weeks of inactivity and minor irritations had reduced me to a passive state where I felt almost incapable of concentration. At this time, I was deeply interested in Nijinsky, who had died recently, particularly in his attempt to create a new kind of choreography with intense hieratic movements. When I was alone, I used to practice ballet exercises, and if there was suitable music on the radio, I would experiment with these Nijinsky movements. One evening, the Liebestode from Tristan came on. Its unexpectedness produced a shock of pleasure and concentration. I made an effort to retain this concentration. It seemed as difficult as balancing on one toe, but the movement helped. As my attention began to waver, the climax of the Liebestode induced a new effort of concentration, and quite suddenly, for a space of a second or two, I had a sense of absolute and total control over time. As if I could order it to stand still. Wow. The past ceased to be something that receded from me, like the scenery going past a train. It felt as if I could relive it as easily as I could put on a gramophone record for a second time. The metabolic processes of the body seemed to be as much within my control as the muscles in my arms and legs. Okay, I think that's halfway. Damn near. Almost halfway. Okay. We'll get through this. The second occasion was related to the first in that I was again listening to Tristan in the Gods at Covent Garden. The sheer length of the opera ends by inducing a sense of freedom, for the unwanted concentration leads to second wind. It was in this second wind that I decided to try to recreate the sensation of timelessness. Accordingly, I began I again began to make an all-out effort of concentration in the last 10 minutes. This time there was no need for physical movement to reinforce the effort. After a few moments there was again the sensation of floating or being suspended, and again the feeling that I could arrest the time processes of the body. This should make clear why I am inclined to reject the notion of the three-dimensional time. It is not Priestley making the same mistake as Donne in treating time as though it was a real entity like the sea, when in fact it is a process like a wave in the sea. And as a process, it is a function of what I have, for convenience, agreed to call the astral body, to distinguish the living conscious me from the physical shell that will eventually die. What happened in these two cases should be fairly clear. Instead of allowing the aesthetic experience to operate upon passive sensibilities, I made an effort to accelerate the process by concentration. This may seem the wrong attitude, for surely doesn't music, like poetry, require a wide-open attitude? Keats's negative capability, quote unquote, but phenomenologists know that this is an error. All perception is an intentional act, even if we are not consciously aware of it. If you relax too much, as in watching television, you begin to feel bored and depressed. I convulsed the muscle of concentration in an all-out effort, and the result was a glimpse of the kind of control over the body that will be possible at the next stage of human evolution. This, incidentally, can be done at any time without preparation, although it is a good idea to try it early in the day when you are feeling fresh. By way of checking this, I just broke off my writing and looked at a colored picture in a Country Life volume on England. Country Life is a title. I'm assuming that's like a magazine. It showed a half-ruined monastery against a background of Yorkshire hills. To my ordinary, unboosted perception, it was just a picture that produced little or no response. I half closed my eyes and concentrated hard, as if preparing for some enormous effort. There was an instant shock of response from the picture, a sense of brooding meaning, as if the hills and the sky were saying something. It remained when I relaxed again. This enables me to state my belief about human evolution very clearly. Certain of our functions are automatic. Breathing, digesting, responding to crisis. This means that I may sink into a completely will-less state, and they will continue unaffected. Other functions ought to be automatic, but they aren't yet. For example, a girl is often surprised at the intensity of her love for her first baby. Her everyday personality may have given her no reason to expect that she would respond so deeply to motherhood. This is an example of our sense of meaning becoming automatic, being taken care of by our instincts. Unfortunately, we do not have the same built-in response to spring mornings and the thousands of other natural phenomena to which we occasionally react with delight. A man who has just been released from prison may have a peak experience when he looks at the sunset, but most of the city dwellers take it for granted, or worse still, they look at it, say, yes, it is beautiful, and don't feel a thing. We have a deeply ingrained habit of passivity which is more dangerous than cigarette smoking or drugs. Why dangerous? Because it produces an inner condition of boredom and stagnation that makes us long for crisis, for excitement, and which explains, for example, the steady rise in the crime rate and the increasingly violent and motiveless nature of crimes. If poisons accumulate in my bloodstream, my body has an automatic method of getting rid of them. I develop boils which burst and release the poisons. But if I allow myself to sink into a state of inner stagnation, I have no automatic defense system against it. I have to seek out some challenge or excitement to restore the vital balance. The sex criminal who goes out looking for a girl to rape is seeking a remedy for his sickness, like a sick dog chewing grass. At this point in evolution, when the earth is overcrowded, man needs to develop an automatic system for dealing with these poisons that arise from stagnation, from the endless triviality of civilized life. He must develop the mental muscle I have spoken of, Faculty X. This is less difficult than it sounds. Anything can become a habit if we really want it to. We must first recognize the necessity. What is the relation of Faculty X to other occult faculties, powers, or mediumship, for example? I can best illustrate the difference with an example. During the First World War, the playwright Harley Granville Barker deserted his first wife, the actress Lila McCarthy. Lila. I'll say Lila. For an American heiress named Helen Huntington. The new Mrs. Barker hated her husband's former theatrical contacts and made him give up the theater. In 1925, Bernard Shaw was asked to second a vote of thanks to Barker at a public meeting. He took the opportunity to say that Barker's retirement from the theater was a public scandal and went on to urge him to come back. Suddenly, Shaw experienced a violent pain in his back, quote, as if my spine had been converted into a bar of rusty iron which grated on the base of my skull, end quote. He could not even bend down to enter a taxi and had to walk home. 1 month later, to the very hour, he decided that he must force himself to go for a walk, and the pain vanished as suddenly as it had come. It was later that he told this story to Lady Colfax, who had been sitting next to Helen Granville Barker at the meeting. Lady Colfax told him that while he was speaking, Mrs. Barker was leaning forward in her chair, staring at his back, quote, every muscle in her body rigid with hate, end quote. It seems likely, then, that Helen Huntington was a witch, whether consciously or unconsciously. She possessed some of the powers of the evil eye that John Cowper Poise found so disconcerting in himself. This hypothesis might seem to be further confirmed by her extraordinary influence over her husband. Barker was undoubtedly one of the greatest men of the theater in the first decade of this century. He was also a major playwright. He and his first wife had always been happy together, and there was no sign of a break before he met the American heiress. In 1914, Barker was 37. Helen Huntington was 50. Whether she bewitched him in the true sense of the word, bearing in mind Graves's remark that young men sometimes use magical powers to seduce girls, or whether he simply fell in love with her in the normal way, she certainly retained an iron hold over him to the end of his life. Lila McCarthy described how she went to Shaw numb with misery. Quote, I was shivering. Shaw sat very still. The fire brought me warmth. How long we sat there I do not know, but presently I found myself walking with dragging steps with Shaw beside me, up and down Adelphi Terrace. The weight upon me grew a little lighter, and released the tears which would never come before. He let me cry. Presently I heard a voice in which all the gentleness and tenderness of the world was speaking. It said, Look up, dear, look up to the heavens. There is more in life than this. There is much more. End quote. It might seem a quibble to say that Shaw also used a form of witchcraft to comfort her, but he certainly used the authentic magical method. To allow his intuitions to operate, to avoid the obvious, rational way of comforting her with words and arguments, but to allow a telepathic link to grow up between them. A lesser man might have felt constrained to hold out false hopes. Shaw somehow lanced the emotional boil, then tried to restore her sense of objectivity. Quote, "There is more in life than this, there is much more," end quote. This is the secret in the poet's heart of the last lines of Candida as Eugene walks out into Tristan's holy night. And here I think the distinction becomes very clear. Helen Huntingdon seems to have possessed magical powers, but she used them in the service of narrow personal ends. Shaw used them in the service of Faculty X, the expansion of the human faculties beyond the merely personal. This is ultimately the only correct use of the occult powers. Most of the examples described in this book, from calling porpoises to raising the shade of Apollonius of Tyana, are the misuse of such powers. But I must repeat that it is incorrect to use the term occult powers as if they were different in kind from our normal faculties. They are simply another part of the spectrum. They are occult only in the sense that human beings have half forgotten them in the process of developing the rational powers. But the next stage of evolution, the development of a still higher range of rational powers, will involve the redevelopment of these faculties. This point has been interestingly confirmed by researches into the pineal eye, the organ in the brain that the Hindus declare to be the seat of the occult powers, and even the thoroughly rational Descartes identified it as the point where a man's soul and his body interact. The pineal organ was assumed to be a vestigial eye, the third eye, although no one could quite decide what use an eye would be in the middle of the brain. Okay. In the present century, scientists began to recognize an odd connection between the pineal eye and sexuality. Otto Hübner, a German doctor, discovered that a young boy with overdeveloped genitals had a tumor of the pineal organ. An American, Virginia Fisk, found that if rats were constantly exposed to light, their pineal organs decreased in size while their sexual organs increased. It was finally established that the pineal organ is a gland, not a vestigial eye, and that it produces a hormone that was labeled melatonin, and a great deal more research established that melatonin is produced by the action of a certain enzyme upon a chemical called serotonin. So he's talking about these things as being fairly new to him, when we've known about them, obviously, for over 50 years, because he was writing this in 1971. And here the real mystery begins, one that has only been partially solved at the time of writing. This chemical serotonin seems to have a great deal to do with evolution of species. The primates, men and apes, have more serotonin than any other species, far more. It seems to be manufactured in the pineal eye, and one of its functions is to inhibit sexual development and to increase intelligence. This seems to explain why most intelligent human beings seem to be late developers sexually, and why early developers are seldom, if ever, remarkable for intelligence. One of the fascinating sidelights on this discovery is that the Bo tree, the tree under which Buddha is said to have achieved enlightenment, produces figs called Ficus religiosus in honor of Gautama, with an exceptionally high serotonin content, which leads to the interesting speculation that the Buddha's diet was the ideal one on which to achieve rational enlightenment on the human condition. In 1948, the mind-changing properties of LSD-25 were discovered accidentally when a Swiss chemist named Hoffmann, working with ergot, a fungus found in rye plants, began to suffer from hallucinations. It was discovered that this was caused by a component of the ergot that was later named LSD-25, and whose properties were closely allied to those of mescaline. a chemical derived from the Mexican plant peyote. Both mescaline and LSD may produce intensified consciousness, a feeling of oneness with the universe, beautiful patterns of colors and lights, new vividness of perception. They do this apparently by somehow blocking man's rational faculty. I have said that we close our mental doors and windows in order to think clearly. These chemicals open them and leave them propped open. The exact way in which they did this was not known, but it now seems fairly certain that the LSD molecule produces its effect by destroying the serotonin molecule. A team of scientists in the Fairfield Hills Hospital in Newtown, Connecticut, made the interesting discovery that schizophrenic patients had exceptionally low serotonin levels in the brain, and for a while it was hoped that medicine had at last discovered a cure for schizophrenia, serotonin. But no one has discovered so far how to convey the serotonin to the place where it matters, the pineal gland. I would also speculate that this notion that schizophrenia is due to serotonin deficiency may be putting the cart before the horse. Schizophrenia is a state of low vitality in which our subconscious robot takes over most of the vital functions, which means that the I walks around in a kind of dream, alienated from existence. It may well be that the serotonin deficiency is the result of this drop in vitality and stagnation of the will. I have described elsewhere my own experience with mescaline. It made rational thought difficult and seemed to flood me with tides of emotion and intuitive insight. For example, I had a strong intuition that the area where I lived in Cornwall had been connected with witchcraft in the past. I have not been able to verify this. There was certainly a strong sense of universal benevolence, but as far as I was concerned, this did not compensate for the loss of the ability to focus with my mind, the feeling that the muscles of concentration had been paralyzed. It was clear to me that mescaline produced its effects by switching off the brain's normal filtering mechanisms, allowing the senses to become flooded with the richness of the physical world. In doing this, it immobilized Faculty X. The illuminations produced by mescaline were the reverse of the mental intensity that sometimes develops in me when I am working well. In fact, the mescaline experience was the reverse of intensity. It was a lowering of the mental pressure, a diffusion of the beam of concentration. I find that when I'm in a state of intense insight, this beam of concentration narrows until it has a laser-like intensity, and there is a feedback relation between the concentration and the perception of meaning. Mescaline destroyed all possibility of feedback. It simply opened the senses and let everything in. All this would suggest that serotonin is a chemical that is connected with concentration and with Faculty X. It also explains precisely why occult powers such as mediumship, telepathy, ESP are in some ways the opposite of Faculty X. They are certainly certainly related to the state of receptivity produced by mescaline or LSD, and Faculty X is related to the state of concentration that depends on serotonin. I do not write produced by serotonin because I believe that our serotonin production may depend on the amount of concentration we habitually engage in. John N. Bleibtreu writes in his biochemical study, The Parable of the Beast, quote, "So far, all that we really know is that minute quantities of serotonin affect mental states, alter perceptions, and that new dimensions of conventional reality accompany changes in the level of serotonin in the brain," end quote. And he adds that serotonin is crucial to rational thought. This would seem to support my guess that concentration is accompanied by a rise in the serotonin levels of the brain and increased activity of the pineal gland, and that serotonin is the Faculty X chemical. But observe the corollary to this. If serotonin production depends on the amount of concentration we habitually engage in, then it can be increased by an increased habit of concentration. Conversely, the chief danger of psychedelic drugs, and probably of marijuana, is that their habitual use would cause a drop in the brain's serotonin production. It seems that the next step in human evolution depends simply upon acquiring habits of mental intensity to replace our usual habit of passivity. The antelope can run like the wind, the salmon smell its home river from 3,000 miles away, the electric eel deliver a shock of 600 volts, the dolphin swim with the speed of an express train, the robin navigate by picking up vibrations from the Milky Way, in each case, a faculty we all possess has been developed into a super faculty by effort. The faculty that distinguishes all the primates, man in particular, from these creatures is the ability to focus meaning, to learning. The most impressive thing about man is his ability to master such a variety of skills, and to master them to such an incredible degree. Acrobats turn somersaults on high wires. Houdini escapes from an iron safe full of water. William Rowan Hamilton knows Latin, Greek, and Hebrew at the age of 5. Zara Colburn multiplies enormous figures in his head within seconds. Athletes continually establish new world records. A century ago, the Matterhorn was regarded as unclimbable. Now mountaineers stroll up it for a Sunday excursion. There seems to be nothing that man cannot do if he sets his mind to it. Once he has the clear idea of what he wants to do, he seems to be unconquerable. His problem has never been willpower, but imagination, to know what he ought to turn his will towards. And this constitutes the greatest cause for optimism at this point in history. Nostradamus and Edgar Cayce notwithstanding, evolution proceeds in leaps, and man has now reached the interesting point where he is prepared to understand it consciously and move forward with a full understanding of what he is doing. Our trouble is in the past has been poor communication between intelligence and instinct, which has meant that the intelligent people lacked power and vitality, while the instinctive people lacked vision and long-distance purpose. Intelligence and instinct can be united by the development of Faculty X. Once man understands this, nothing can hold him back. And now I come to the most important point in this book, the attempt at a general theory. Let us for the moment forget the evidence for telepathy, precognition, reincarnation, and life after death, and stick to logic and the facts revealed by science. The vitalist theory of evolution, for which I have argued in this book, affirms that spirit and matter are antagonists. There is a war going on, and we are in the front line. Our universe is apparently expanding. Astronomers have calculated that if it has always expanded at its present rate, then it must have started about 10 billion years ago, 10,000 million years. Our sun is about 6 billion years old and is expected to last another 6 billion. This Earth we inhabit is probably around 3 billion years old. For the first billion years of its existence, it remained a roaring furnace, sweeping around the sun and slowly cooling, and at some point the force of life managed to establish a foothold in the realm of atoms. T.E. Hume, a disciple of Bergson, described life as, quote, the gradual insertion of more and more freedom into matter, end quote, and went on, quote, in the amoeba, then you might say that impulse has manufactured a small leak through which free activity could be inserted into the world, and the process of evolution has been the gradual enlargement of this leak, end quote. Life began by molding atoms into the molecules known as amino acids, and then used these to create living cells. The modern Darwinian school of biology would have us believe that this complexification was an accident, which is like asking us to believe that a pile of rusty car parts in a scrapyard might be blown together into a new Rolls-Royce. For another billion years or so, these minute living cells floated in the warm seas, birthless and deathless, no change taking place. It was not until a mere half-billion years ago that true evolution began. Life somehow managed to overcome its most basic problem, forgetfulness. Evolution cannot proceed without the accumulation of knowledge, and a single amoeba cannot accumulate much knowledge. It was not until the life force invented the trick of coding knowledge into the reproductory processes that new advances became possible. The Precambrian creatures shed old cells and grew new ones in the same way that my body replaces all its old cells every 8 years. With the invention of death and reproduction, they shed old bodies and grew new ones. Variety replaced monotony as the basic law of existence. Life invented death. There is no escaping this extraordinary fact, although a more conservative view might be that life simply learned to make use of death for its own purposes. The implications are the same. Life is not at the mercy of death. It is in control of death. Half a billion years ago, it learned the secret of reincarnation. The aim of all this maneuvering was to establish a firmer bridgehead in the universe of matter. Individual creatures tend to stagnate when they have discovered a comfortable ritual of habit. A young creature fights and struggles and learns. An old creature vegetates. Death was invented to replace the vegetables with fighters and learners, to get the old soldiers out of the front line and replace them with shock troops. The next major step in this war, or process of colonization, was the invention of consciousness, that is to say, of a group of faculties set apart from the instinctive drives, and their purpose? To observe and record and keep files. Consciousness might be described as the life force's secret police organization, and like the secret police, in any totalitarian state, it is the servant of the government, a powerful and formidable servant, but a servant nonetheless. Consciousness was a late evolutionary development because it was a long time before life could afford the energy for such an experiment. The instincts pay attention only to what deeply concerns them. The job of consciousness is to pay attention to everything, to keep watch on the surface movements of the world of matter. Most of the information it accumulates in this way is repetitive and useless, but occasionally its non-stop vigilance pays off, and a few random observations coalesce to form a new piece of knowledge. Consciousness has one immense disadvantage. It divides life against itself. When life was confined to the instinctive levels, its drives were simple. Its aim was to increase its foothold in the realm of matter. Consciousness is concerned with superficial problems. The secret police know nothing about the ultimate aims of the government, about its economic and foreign policies. This does not matter so long as the government retains a firm control, but the success of consciousness has been so spectacular that it has become a kind of government department in itself, and this is dangerous. The danger has been immensely increased in the past few centuries. The invention of writing gave immense impetus to human evolution and changed man's vision of himself. There is no evidence that Isaac Newton was more intelligent than Moses or Confucius, but he had subtler methods of storing and utilizing his knowledge. As a result of 3 centuries of Newtonian science, man has become king of his earthly castle. He no longer takes life and death for granted as his ancestors did. He looks out on the universe with the eye of a master. But consciousness is not the master. It is the servant. It lacks the power and drive of the instinctive life force. Left to itself, it tends to become passive and bewildered, alienated from the world of instinct and the world of matter. It is a master who has lost all feeling of mastery. Human evolution has advanced too fast. Its processes have become too complicated for its own good. but they can be simplified. Consciousness can be turned inward to the understanding of the vital processes and the evolutionary drives. The chief enemy of life is not death, but forgetfulness, stupidity. We lose direction too easily. This is the great penalty that life paid for descending into matter, a kind of partial amnesia. But it is the next step in the argument that is the crucial one. The universe is full of all kinds of energies. Matter is energy, the most resistant and uncompromising kind of energy, and if life has succeeded in achieving some degree of conquest of matter, it is absurd to suppose that it has not succeeded with more malleable forms of energy. Oh, is it not? Is it absurd? We are back to David Foster's notion of an intelligent universe, but now it is unnecessary to ask who does the coding. We know the answer, the force of life itself, which has been conducting its campaign for colonization for more than 1 billion years. All this arises logically from the recognition that life is not an emanation of matter, but an opposed force. Shaw's Lilith says, quote, "I brought life into the whirlpool of force and compelled my enemy, matter, to obey a living soul, but in enslaving life's enemy, I made him life's master," end quote. And earlier, in the same act of Back to Methuselah, he expresses the intuition that life may exist on higher energy levels. Quote, "In the hard-pressed heart of the earth, where the inconceivable heat of the sun still glows, the stone lives in fierce atomic convulsion. As we live in our slower way, when it is cast to the surface, it dies like a deep-sea fish." End quote. Alfred North Whitehead, another vitalist philosopher who expressed this notion that life permeates the universe as water might fill a sponge. The great unsolved mystery is that of individuality. If life is somehow a unity, how is it that each of its units feels so separate and unique? Chesterton expressed it in this magnificent last chapter of The Man Who Was Thursday. Quote, "Why does each thing on the earth war against each other thing? Why does each small thing in the world have to fight against the world itself? Why does a fly have to fight the whole universe?" End quote. Not only why, but how. Perhaps there are creatures in the world, as Sir Alister Hardy suggests, who possess a quote-unquote communal consciousness. Perhaps these are gnats hovering in a cloud who are as aware of one another's existence as of their own. But we cannot even conceive of this. A crowd of pot smokers practicing quote-unquote togetherness are deceiving themselves, as a child might deceive herself. Come on. As a child might deceive herself that her doll was alive. Human individuality is so absolute that we can no more imagine ourselves without it than we can imagine 1 and 1 make 3. The how is unanswerable. We can only assume that the force of life began its conquest of matter by somehow splitting itself into units, each of which felt separate from the rest of the universe. Chesterton answers the why. Quote, so that each thing that obeys the law may have the glory and isolation of the anarchist, so that each man fighting for order may be as brave and a good man as the dynamiter." End quote. Which means simply that without individuality, life would not build up the same desperate force. The man of the crowd is a weakling. People who need people are the stupidest people in the world. And so the basic paradox of human nature seems to be inherent in the force of life itself. Without challenge or crisis, it takes things easy and collapses into mediocrity. Hey, that's where we're at now. So far, all life on Earth has had to be driven forward, as slaves once had to be whipped into battle. It has never possessed positive purpose, only the negative one of staying alive and avoiding pain. Quote, "Evil is physical pain, end quote, said Leonardo, going to the heart of the matter. The old theological question, why evil, is answered by the recognition that without evil, there would be universal mediocrity, terminating in death. It is only at this point in the Earth's history that this has ceased to be wholly true. With the development of art, science, philosophy, man has acquired the possibility of a positive purpose, a purpose towards which he can drive forward instead of being driven from behind. It is true that religion has always been an expression of this purpose, but religion was content with paradox, the assertion that the world must somehow be denied by the Spirit, without trying to understand why this should be necessary. If positive purpose could be established as the human driving force, it would be a turning point in evolution, for it is many times stronger than the negative purpose of avoiding pain. A man can do things out of love or enthusiasm that would be impossible out of fear. His chief problem at the moment is to escape the narrowness of everyday triviality and grasp the nature of his goal. This, in turn, will require the development of what Blake called imagination, but which it would be more accurate to call Faculty X. Our universe seems to be based on the principle of individuality, in which each unit of life is a kind of oasis. We have only to concede that individuality transcends the physical body. That is, to recognize that, like death, it is a tool of life, not an accidental consequence. To see that logic is in favor of some form of life after death, as well as of reincarnation. The whole purpose of life's campaign against matter is to establish continuity, to overcome forgetfulness. This is the purpose behind instinct and racial memory and the DNA code. These are all forms of survival of bodily death. If other forms did not exist, it would be, to say the least, an extraordinary waste of opportunity. Nathaniel Hawthorne felt that Hume's feats of mediumship and levitation were interesting but irrelevant. Why? Because he was an artist, and the artist loves the physical world. Like Camus, watching the great birds in the sky at Gemini, he wants to feel the weight of his life squarely on his own shoulders, and the talk of an afterlife seems a false promise. The artist sees clearly that the solution to the curious pointlessness of most human existence is not another life, but the occasional moments of ecstatic intensity and control when this universe seems infinitely interesting and the idea of eternal life in this universe entirely delightful. This is an idea that can be found in Russian mysticism, in Fedorov, Dostoevsky, Razanov. That eternal life means life on this earth, not in another world. That Jehovah's Witnesses, oddly enough, hold a similar doctrine, that after the day of judgment the earth will turn into paradise. All this explains why the poet is distrustful of the afterlife. He is less inclined than most human beings to devalue this one. The theory I have propounded resolves the contradiction. The poet is right to be mistrustful about other worlds as a solution to the problems of this one. If my reasoning is correct, then the other world is not intended to be a solution. We are in the front line. The general is back at headquarters. The other worlds that exist between us and the headquarters are support units and supply depots, not a higher level of existence. There's probably more freedom on these levels, the possibility of broader vision, wider consciousness, but of less actual achievement. The possibility of achievement lies back here where we are. We see the answer to the riddle of physical existence in all moments of great intensity. God is the fire in the head, said Nijinsky. When the brain blazes like a bonfire, we no longer need to ask why we are alive. The aim is total control. With this control established, life would become a unity. There would no longer be a distinction between other worlds and this one. And is this not suggested by the sudden birth of spiritualism in the 19th century? The 19th century was the age of Romanticism. For the first time in history, man stopped thinking of himself as an animal or a slave and saw himself as a potential god. All of the cries of revolt against God, de Sade, Byron's Manfred, Schiller's Robbers, Goethe's Faust, Hoffmann's mad geniuses, are expressions of this new spirit. Is this why the spirits decided to make a planned and consistent effort at communication? It was the right moment. Man was beginning to understand himself. I do not regard myself as an occultist because I am not interested in the mechanisms of everyday consciousness. In the past, man's chief characteristic has been his defeat-proneness. Even the giants of the 19th century were inclined to believe that insanity is a valid refuge from the trivialities of everydayness. But the answer lies in understanding the mechanisms of consciousness. Once they are understood, they can be altered to admit more reality. The operation requires concentration and precision, the virtues of a skilled watchmaker. We return to the assertion of the opening chapter. Man's future lies in the cultivation of faculty X. And that is that book. We are done. Whew! It was a rough start for this session. I was droopy right off the bat. But we made it through. And where is the book? Where is the book? Is this the book? Yes. Okay, I only got one vote on the next book out of the 4 that I listed, and it was for this one. 48 Liberal Lies About American History. So that is what we're going to start in on next time. I don't know how long these each are. It looks like just kind of flipping through. Some of them are only a page or two. So we'll just, I don't know, I'll just read a couple till I've reached about an hour of reading and go on. It's fairly small type. I can read it, but I'll probably end up using these. And then it's not too bad. Yeah. So, yep. I'm gonna guess 300 pages. Nope. Not even. It is 242 pages. So, we'll jump in on that one the next time I read, which might be Tuesday night. But then, of course, it's Thanksgiving, and I'm going to be out of town, so we'll see. But enough of that. I'm going to end this stream and jump into some Far Cry 6, I think. So I will see you in the next one.
Is broken on his feet because I have seen apart. I have known about the way. I didn't anything to say. Follow your heart, don't take it, leave it behind. Someone will bring. I left you my heart. What did you do? You left me soft. Was my love? Was it love? You have no answers. Don't know without you. How will I survive? have no answers. Don't know when